and we are now in public session. So just to remind, as always, members and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones, please. I'd like to welcome today Minister Paschal Donohoe, Minister for Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform, and accompanied today by Celine Scott, Principal Officer, Brendan O'Leary, Assistant Principal, and John Canan, Principal Officer. I'd like to thank you for making yourselves available to the committee. The purpose of our meeting today is to go through the reporting on the summer economic statement. But before we get to your opening statement, Minister, obviously just to do the regular statement on privilege. So just to advise you that by virtue of section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of the proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are also reminded of the long-standing practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So with that privilege statement concluded, Minister, I would now obviously like to thank you again for your attendance here today at our committee. It's always welcome to engage with you, and I would like you now, if you could, to make your opening statement to us.
Thank you, Chairman, and I welcome the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon to discuss the summer economic statement that was published on the 25th of June. The statement sets out the key elements of the government's medium-term economic and budgetary strategy and updates the economic parameters for discussion in the Dáil in advance of Budget 2020. A decade on from the financial crisis, we have experienced a remarkable recovery. We have a well-managed economy, our public finances are on a sustainable trajectory, and economic growth is steady, is robust, and it is broadly based. However, while progress is there, and progress is particularly there in terms of the number of our citizens that are now at work, this progress cannot be taken for granted. It has been achieved and needs to be maintained through careful decisions. The job now is to build upon this progress and ensure that we are ready to respond to the challenges of today and tomorrow, but also the opportunities that do lie ahead. This year, my department is projecting gross domestic product growth of 3.9%. We are also projecting a budget surplus of 0.2% of gross domestic product. With unemployment now at its lowest level since 2005, the labour market is approaching full employment. As I've said in the past, budgetary policy must lean against the wind. When times are good, we must do our best to build up our budgetary resources and reinforce the resilience of the economy to withstand shocks. A clear policy lesson from our peer group of other small open economies at EU level is that they typically operate budget surpluses when their economies are performing close to potential. This not only facilitates the building up of budgetary capacity, but also means that these states have been able to increase public expenditure in a sustainable manner, with incremental spending increases based on solid improvements in their economies. As such, they've been largely able to avoid a pro-cyclical policy approach. Furthermore, they enjoy a high stock of public infrastructure as investment is maintained. This, in turn, improves economic competitiveness, increases growth potential, and improves both the standard and the quality of life for their citizens. Since the publication of the Stability Programme update, the risks to the economy have intensified. Volatile corporation tax revenues continue to be of concern. the international trade environment is increasingly uncertain, and the economy moves towards full employment and thereby raising an issue of potential overheating. And perhaps most worryingly, the prospect of a disorderly Brexit in October has become significantly more likely. Given these risks, both at home and abroad, framing Budget 2020 in the autumn will be more challenging than in recent years. As Minister for Finance, my task is to guide the economy through these risks with careful management of decisions and our public finances. And I'll aim to do this through steady and sustainable improvements in living standards, financed by steady and sustainable revenue streams. As I have said on many occasions, the UK's exit from the European Union will have a detrimental effect on our economy. But the magnitude of that impact depends upon how disorderly that exit is. There is no precedent in modern economic history for an event like Brexit, and as such, predicting its impact precisely is difficult. Given all of the above, the SES has been prepared on the basis of one budget with two different budgetary scenarios. The same broad strategy applies in both scenarios. The outcomes, however, are very different. So, consistent with the fiscal projections published in the SPU, the Budget 2020 framework involves a budgetary package of €2.8 billion for 2020. With expenditure commitments of €1.9 billion, including €0.7 billion or a 10% increase in capital investments, and an expenditure reserve of up to €200 million, with the capacity to accommodate funding requirements for the National Broadband Plan and the National Children's Hospital. This in turn leaves €700 million to be specifically allocated as part of the budget. In the event of an orderly Brexit, given our position in the economic cycle, this is the appropriate budgetary policy and delivers a surplus of 0.4% of national income. This would allow for the capacity to deal with the impact of Brexit. Further expenditure or tax reductions which are unfunded outside of these parameters would risk contributing to a potential overheating in the economy and thereby jeopardise the sustainability of our public finances. If, as it appears possible, there is a disorderly Brexit, there will be significant pressure placed on our finances in that situation. Upon a disorderly Brexit, the government will therefore look at adopting a holding position in relation to allowing our automatic stabilisers to provide counter-cyclical support, and then we will put in place targeted and temporary supports to help our citizens, our sectors and those parts of our country which will be most affected. And this is in line with the advice of the IMF. A disorderly Brexit scenario could involve a headline deficit of between 0.5% and 1.5% of national income for next year. This, at the outer end of that spectrum, will involve a negative swing in the headline balance of up to €6 billion. This twin approach mitigates the requirement for a supplementary budget in the event of a disorderly Brexit. And as the picture becomes clearer, the government will take a decision in September as to which of these two scenarios will underpin our forecasts for Budget 2020. As Brexit approaches, it's essential that we are cognizant of the risks to the economy domestically. In particular, the high concentration of corporation tax receipts experienced in recent years could represent a more vulnerable revenue stream in the future. I have said that public spending must only be financed by revenue that's sustainable, and therefore basing expenditure increases on transitory sources of funding wouldn't be in line with my commitment to a careful budgetary policy. So with this in mind, I've asked my officials to prepare a paper on fiscal vulnerabilities in Ireland, including a range of policy options to mitigate the risks inherent in the concentration of corporation tax receipts, and those resulting from a narrow and literal interpretation of the European fiscal rules. The paper will be published shortly, and I'll consider the proposals contained within with a view to making a recommendation to government in the autumn. I should point out that action has already been taken. We've begun to run budgetary surpluses. We've established a rainy day fund. We have broadened the tax base. However, we need to continue to work at this in the years to come. The medium-term approach outlined in relation to expenditure under the orderly scenario with post-2020, current expenditure growing at 3.25% and overall annual expenditure growth of 3.5% would allow for an annual increase in expenditure below the growth rate as represented by modified gross national income. This is appropriate given the uncertainties in the external environment and the current position in the economic cycle. Because of the progress that we have made, we are entering a time of uncertainty. Capital spending has substantially increased, laying the foundations for future improvements in our living standards. The unemployment rate has fallen to close to historic lows. However, new risks are developing, and with that in mind, I will look at putting in place the most sensible budgetary strategy and recommending that to Dáil Éireann. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Minister. A number of deputies have obviously indicated to me, and with the normal provisos on the timing requires for a first round of questioning, I have the first deputy is Deputy McGrath.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to welcome the Minister and his officials here today, and thank you for the opening statement, Minister. If I can just start with, it's somewhat of a technical question, but it's a really important one. The indicative figure that you have penciled in for tax reductions of €600 million per annum, so it's in Annex 1, page 38, the very last page of the Summer Economic Statement. Can you tell us where does that sit within Table 6 on page 27, so where you go through the indicative nominal budgetary package and how much of that is pre-committed and so on? Where does the €600 million of indicative tax reductions fit into that table?
It's inside that. So the €600 million, that figure is generated by the non-indexation of the tax code against income growth.
Sure.
And then that €600 million forms part of the unallocated figure of €700 million.
Okay, so it's part of the unallocated. So
it's not in addition. So there's not a figure of €1.3 billion.
So the €2.8 billion is not after allowing for €600 million of tax cuts.
It's included within it.
You're saying that any tax cuts by way of a budget day announcement has to come out of your unallocated amount of €700 million, which is D, line D on that.
Yes, indeed. So just to be completely clear then, row D on table 6 of an unallocated figure of 700, within that includes
the potential for tax cuts,
which you're referring to, and that is in line with how I've handled unallocated resources in previous budgets.
Okay, that's fine, because that wasn't clear to me, and from parliamentary replies last night it wasn't entirely clear to me, but that does explain it. So when the Taoiseach says today before the ICTU conference that there would be €600 million of tax reductions next year, I would have thought that no budgetary decisions have been made, but that seemed to be a statement of fact.
But no budgetary decisions have been made. That is the case, and we are beginning our budgetary process at the moment, and any decisions in relation to level of tax changes will depend on where we are in either of the two scenarios that I've outlined in the Summer Economic Statement, and with budget day decisions that are made.
Okay, so it was not a statement of fact. If that's how it came across, it shouldn't be, because no decision has been made on the composition of your budget day package, including tax or expenditure. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And as I have said, within the 700 figure there, and within all of the unallocated resources that are illustrated from 2021 onwards, that includes the 600 figure.
So I think the position of government is that by mid-September or so, the Taoiseach will come to a conclusion as to what is the most likely Brexit scenario, and will advise you accordingly, and that will determine the shape of your budget. But can you just give us a sense of how your budget will be different based on the two scenarios, one of the benign outcome of a deal and an orderly Brexit, or secondly, scenario B, a disorderly Brexit? What will be very different about the two potential budgets that you will introduce on the 8th of October?
Well, there will be two key differences. One is the policy, and then one is the deficit impact. What will be, if I talk about the deficit impact first,
I think, yeah, we have that from the tables. That's pretty clear. But
it's a pretty crucial difference, though.
What I'm asking is the budget that you'll announce.
Yeah, but it's a
what will the difference be?
Sure. Well, I'll prefix that with what I'm going to say from a content point of view. The difference between a surplus of 0.4% and the deficit of up to 1.5% is a very significant difference, as you've acknowledged.
Sure.
In terms of the policy content, that is where a key area of difference will be. From a policy content point of view, what each of the budgets would have in common is putting in place enough funding to ensure that the level of services that we have in place at the moment is maintained. And then from a discretionary policy point of view, if we're in an orderly scenario, the government would be looking to put in place policy improvements or changes that reflect the fact that we have a growing economy. If we're facing into a disorderly scenario, we will have to use either the resources that are available there and also the potential for further borrowing if needed to do two things: to put in place the funding, to put in place support measures for our economy if a disorderly Brexit is happening, and also to have the funding in place to finance increases that we may face as a result of the number of people not at work in our economy needing support growing.
But the essential difference on budget day will be the composition of the amount you have in play of the 700 million. It's what you will decide to do with that really is the difference.
It's the policy composition of that 700, but I also want to leave open, to be clear, that if we move into a budget day scenario, which involves the risk of a disorderly Brexit, at that point, if further funding is needed to respond back to changes that we think are likely to happen in our economy, the case could be made then to fund that via a higher deficit.
Okay, can I ask you this, Minister, because the outturn this year will be important and will feed into next year and the budget and so on. And in the Department of Health vote, which includes the HSE, so yesterday's fiscal monitor is showing an underspend to the end of June of €33 million in the health vote. Yet Minister Harris told the Dáil yesterday that the HSE is €116 million over budget to the end of April, which is consistent with what Paul Reid said before PAC recently. I think he said it was 103 million to the end of March. So just can you square that for me? How is it that on the very same day we have the official Exchequer figures being published that show an underspend in health of €33 million, while at the same time we have the Minister for Health standing up in the Dáil saying the HSE is €116 million over budget to the end of April?
Sure, well, there's two reasons why, Deputy. The first one is a time lag effect. The HSE have figures available up to the end of April, which I think is the figures that you quoted. We're looking at expenditure that has also happened in May and June. And the second reason why is the figures that I have here include both the HSE and the Department of Health. And as we stand at the moment, the figures that to the end of June show a current increase of 6.9% versus a budgeted increase of 6.3%, which shows a degree of overperformance at the moment, which means this is a key area that I need to be very careful on for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I accept the figures published yesterday include more than the HSE, but the vast bulk, I would imagine a very, very high percentage of that health vote is the HSE budget. And I don't think you're suggesting that they went from being €116 million over budget to the end of April to being underspent by 33 million to the end of June. Like, there's an issue here with the system of accounting, Minister. That's the point I'm getting to, because it seems to me the HSE is not using a proper accruals-based system of accounting. Known liabilities are not being accounted for. We had the same issue last year. I think the Exchequer figures were saying to the end of September that the deficit was about 300 million, and yet the supplementary estimate came in at over 600 million. So there's a real issue of accounting here.
No, I think you make a fair point. There are different accounting systems in place, but there is also a phasing issue in that we are dealing with a further 2 months, and a huge amount of effort is going on at the moment to how we can ensure we manage health expenditure inside the budget day parameters. But the latter point that you went on to make, Deputy, is correct, which is that at times in managing our expenditure within the Department of Health, the issue has arisen towards the end of the year as opposed to earlier on in the year. To mind, that is not what happened last year, and that is why I am being very careful in my assessment of where we stand with health expenditure at the moment. I'm simply saying there has been an improvement on where we were last year, but this is an area that's going to require constant focus from me for the rest of the year.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. I think you were keen to move on.
Well, you've 30 seconds or so if you have a
Okay, maybe just one more, Minister. Again, you had an over and back with Deputy Doherty in the Dáil there recently about the Christmas bonus, and you were adamant that it's in the base, is what you kept saying, and giving the impression that it's budgeted for. Now, my understanding is that it's in the base to the extent that it's in the outturn from last year. It was spent, so it's in the outturn. But every year you produce a set of estimates of what you intend to spend in the current year. It's not in the estimates. So to say it's in the base does not mean it's budgeted for. So maybe can you just take us through that? Because
I'm sure you're stealing Deputy Doherty's thunder with asking that question to me, and I'm going to come on to him in a moment. But what I said in the Dáil, and I accept that the debate that's been caused by it since then, when I said it was in the base, I meant that it was in our outturn for last year, as you have said. It was spent last year. But of course, the point that Deputy Doherty has made subsequent to that it is not yet budgeted for this year, is correct. That is a decision that remains to be made.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Deputy McGrath. Deputy Breathnach, you're next.
Yeah, firstly, thank you for your statement, and it's good to see that we're at least acknowledging the risks of Brexit and the overheating of the economy, and indeed addressing the debt. And my first question will relate to what is your strategy to reduce that debt? Second, you spoke about employment being at full capacity, and obviously the issues of our skills base. I mean, we hear money being offered right, left and centre to fill the gaps. Yes, I'd like you to comment, Minister, as to whether those gaps can be filled, whether it's consultants, posts, carers or whatever. If we're reaching full capacity and we're offering to provide services, yet the workforce and the skills are not there, are we not codding the people? I mean, the economy is no longer steady as she goes. It's clearly all about concern, caution, correction, indeed clarity around corporation taxes, and you mentioned the fiscal vulnerables. But the second question would relate to the issue of a hard Brexit. Are there other external threats other than that to our economy, such as global overheating or downturn, going to be factored into your budget? The issue of a disorderly or orderly Brexit and the fork in the road that will come in September. What makes you think that we will have any additional information in the run-in to the 31st of October that will make you be in a position to decide on which fork is there? And thirdly, the issue of carbon taxes. We're wondering, would you indicate what course of action you hope to take in regard to those carbon taxes in the forthcoming budget? And while I'm not expecting you to tell us everything, I do believe that the public that I represent want to know, what direction you do intend to take, because people also have to plan the same as yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. So if I deal with some of the points that you've raised there just in turn, if I deal with the issue that you have raised first in terms of where we are from a debt point of view, you'll be aware that the NTMA issued their annual report yesterday, and they're the key agency of the state involved in managing our stock of public debt. And while the overall trajectory of where we are in terms of debt as a percentage of national income is positive, in 2019 that figure now stands at 61%. In 2012 that figure was 120%. Nonetheless, the stock of public debt that we have is still high at over approximately €203 billion. What can we do to reduce it? I believe the most obvious way that is open to reduce that across the short to medium term is by running budget surpluses, if the management of Brexit allows us to do so. In terms of other risks that are out there in addition to Brexit, the key one that I would be aware of would be where we are about the tone in relation to global trade at the moment. Because if you're an open trading economy like Ireland and a shift happens in the tone on global trade, it has the potential to have an effect on our external trading performance, which in turn would have an effect on our national finances. In terms of information that will be available to us when we are in September, at that point we will have a new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Will have been in place then by approaching 2 months. So there should be at that point a degree of clarity regarding the intentions of that person. And then finally, in relation to carbon taxes, in relation to a decision being made on that matter, a decision has not been made in relation to what I would be proposing to do. But what we will be doing at the end of July is we will be publishing our tax strategy group papers, which we do every year. And within that there will be a paper on carbon taxes, and that paper will be informed by a public consultation that will be closing soon regarding different options regarding how carbon taxation could be implemented and how the revenue from carbon taxation could then be used back within our economy and society.
Just share the issue of full employment currently in our workforce. The skills base, we have regular announcements around providing services, whether it's for mental health or issues that are important to us all. Whereas the reality is that the skills that are required, whether it's in mental health, whether it's in dementia or whatever it might be, do we take into account our ability to actually employ those people when we allocate money to the services? Because to me, that's where I use the phrase, we're cutting the people if we make announcements and we're not able to fill the posts. And to me, that's what's regularly happening since I came into this Dáil. We're making announcements and yet we're not filling posts because we're not capable of doing it.
Yes, we do take it into account, but I think it is going to be a bigger issue across the coming years if our labour market continues at this level. And when I was speaking at the National Economic Dialogue there last week, I made the point that if you are in a labour market, if you have a labour market that has a rate of unemployment in it at 4.4%, we need to be increasingly conscious in the future that as we look to make policy decisions and as we look to invest money, are the people there to translate that higher level of resources into work. I do not believe that was an issue even in our recent past, when we would have had an unemployment rate that would have begun with a 5. But now as we move to a figure of 4.4%, and that figure has now remained unchanged as of yesterday, it is an indication that all forms of employers may find it increasingly difficult to get additional new staff to implement new activities, whether that be a company with a commercial service or whether it be the government in terms of providing new services to citizens.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you. I next have Deputy Pearse Doherty.
Minister, A number of questions just in relation to the summer economic statement. Deputy McGrath touched on the issue, and we've clarified this through parliamentary questions anyway, in relation to the fact that the Christmas bonus isn't factored in, and you'll know the debate we had last week was in relation to, indeed, the criticism, not from me, but from the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, that you hadn't factored in the Christmas bonus, and you suggested that it was. You've clarified that issue now in your own way. But going back to the substance of the issue, the Christmas bonus cost last year €285 million. It's not like loose change that you're going to find down the sofa. If it is the intention to pay the Christmas bonus, why are we not factoring it in? Instead of presenting figures which suggest that there's a budget package of 700 million available, and in an appendix there to try and suggest that the Ardèche promise of tax cuts can be doable, that out of that would come 600 million on tax cuts, and then we'll find the Christmas bonus money from somewhere else. Why isn't the Christmas bonus factored in? Surely at this stage it is a policy choice, or are you still dangling this kind of idea, well, we won't, and then, a surprise, we're going to pay the Christmas bonus?
Well, the decision in relation to whether we factor in the Christmas bonus for 2020, you'll have to suspend your judgment on that until we do Budget 2020, which we'll be doing on the 8th of October.
No, you've produced
in relation to your point in relation to the Christmas bonus for this year, the Christmas bonus for this year will be handled in the way the Christmas bonus has been handled for previous years. In relation to the point that you made in relation to tax reductions, number one, the commitment that was made in relation to tax reductions was across a number of years, and as the summer economic statement indicates, in the context of an orderly Brexit across a 5-year period, between 2020 and 2024, there's over €8 billion of unallocated resources for decisions to be made. But I accept, as I indicated in the context of a disorderly Brexit, that if we find ourselves having to manage that risk, there are other decisions that would then need to be taken.
Yeah, I'll come to Brexit in a minute, but this is about the core issue of presenting figures that are credible and are very transparent. And we have, you mentioned we'll have to wait till Budget 2020 to see about the Christmas bonus, but you've presented numbers here in terms of Budget 2020 and indeed 2021, 2022 and so on and so forth. And you've presented figures that there's non-allocated spending of 700 million. So that's the budget package that we have if we want to reach the target of 0.4%. But what is not clear and what is not written in any of this document, and what is not accounted for, despite repeated criticisms from IFAC and others, is that that figure really isn't real, because the 700 million of unallocated expenditure, as we heard last week at this committee, is one thing's for certain is Christmas happens every year, and the Christmas bonus has to come out of that amount. So why don't you factor that in and present a figure that is more real, which is or has more credibility, which is a figure of just over 400 million?
Because we have not made a decision in relation to what's going to happen in December 2020 yet. That's the reason why. The ongoing IFAC criticism, which I'm aware of and which you've reiterated on a number of occasions.
So you're saying you may not...
That you've reiterated on a number of occasions, which is that the level of current expenditure projected growth that we have is not credible or realistic. I have now recognised that in the medium-term expenditure outlook that we have by increasing the rate of planned current expenditure for next year, for the following years after 2020, from 2.5% up to 3.25%, to deal with the charge that has been made that we've underestimated current expenditure growth. You're looking to conflate two different things. The role of the summer economic statement is to say what level of resources are available. It's not to make decisions into how those resources are made.
So clearly what you're saying is that the Christmas bonus may not be paid out next year.
Why do you reach that conclusion?
Because if you are, because you've just said, well, we haven't made a decision on it, so clearly you're saying that the Christmas bonus may not be paid out last year. If you were saying the Christmas bonus will be paid out next year, then you would obviously have to factor it into the figures. You can't have it both ways. So is it the case that the Christmas bonus may not be paid out next year?
I would expect that in October of 2020, if it is me or whoever the Finance Minister of that day will be, that there will be a Christmas bonus. But the decision in relation to that Christmas bonus has not been taken. I am focused at the moment on decisions that I'm going to be making in October 2019, not October 2020. And the track record that I have had over the last number of years is to pay a Christmas bonus, which has been welcomed by those who receive it, as due to the difference it can make to them across the Christmas period.
So, okay, so that criticism from our fiscal advisory watchdog is obviously not being heeded, or you have a different view in relation to how you should proceed in factoring in the Christmas bonus or not. Let's go to the other part of it, which is that the figures that were presented earlier this year were without credibility. Okay, and you've made the point that you've increased the expenditure projections to what you call 2 and a bit, which was it was a lot more than a bit. It was close to 3 to 3 and a quarter. So let me just dig down into those figures. So the expenditure that you increased this year for budget 2020 is 0. That's correct, yes. And the expenditure that you increased next year, to take on board IFAC's criticism that you're not given real credible expenditure figures, was 100 million extra. Would that be correct?
No.
Okay, so this year, can you give me the figure? What expenditure?
So we have, out of our budget day package at the moment, we already have allocated €2.1 billion for expenditure increases.
Let me explain. Maybe I didn't explain myself.
No, you didn't.
So the spring statement had figures presented in it, which the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council says that they were not credible. So the developments between then and now is that you have increased your expenditure projections to 3.25%.
Yes.
The question I have is, since spring to now, what increase have you done in terms of 2020? Was it 0? And what increase have you factored in for 2021? Was it 100 million?
So from 2021 onwards, we have moved from 2.5% to 3.25% of planned expenditure growth. For 2020, I have not announced an expenditure increase beyond that which is pre-committed, because I have not made a decision in relation to the allocation of the €700 million.
Okay, so there's no increase in expenditure this year to deal with the IFAC's position, but in terms of next year, it's 0.1% of GDP. Can you give me a figure in relation to that?
Well, when you say there's no increase for next year, that's wrong.
Since the spring projections.
The reason why that hasn't happened is because we have not made a decision in relation to the allocation of the €700 million. That's why. So if on budget day we make a decision, or I make a decision, that the €700 million is going to be allocated to an expenditure increase and no change anywhere else, then that represents an expenditure increase that is on top of what we've already committed to.
Yeah,
So what you're doing, Deputy, is you're looking to conflate two different things.
I'm not trying to conflate.
The role of the summer economic statement is to say what level of resources are available, of which we then make a decision. So if I was coming in here and I had a medium-term current expenditure forecast of 2.5%, you would be justifiably criticising me on the back of not responding to what IFAC have done. I've changed that.
Not for this year.
No, I haven't done it for this year, and I've explained why.
And that's fine. Now I'm moving to next year, and I want to know how much you've changed it for next year, which is 2021, budget 2021.
Deputy,
but in fairness, I've asked this question a number of times, and I haven't even got the chance to.
You are asking a question that can only be answered on budget day when we make a decision in relation to the allocation of resources.
It's on page 25. It's not 0.1% of GDP. What I'm asking, It's on page 25, the bottom of the table. It's table number 4. For 2021, it's 0.1% of GDP is the additional expenditure. I want a figure on that. And then the next question, if I had time to ask it, is how much of that additional expenditure is actually the national broadband overrun of the project that you've been overseeing that has run out of control? That's the point I'm trying to get to.
Okay, so what we have done is we have increased our expenditure outlook for the coming years in current, as I've detailed a moment ago, and we also increased it on capital to deal with the cost of the National Broadband Plan, as I indicated in my statement on the Summer Economic Statement.
Chair, this is deeply frustrating. I have asked a very simple question on Table 5, close the book now in frustration. What is the additional allocation that you factored in on Table 4 of page 25 of expenditure developments, which is minus 0.1% of GDP, because that component is made up of two things. One is the overrun in the national development, the national broadband plan, and the second is expenditure. What I really want to get to is, are you actually listening to IFAC? Because you can say we've increased expenditure, but that's because you've just allowed that project to run away, as opposed to what they're saying is that your expenditure on a number of headline items is not credible. Like, for example, we are already seeing an overrun in health, which will materialise at the end of the year, which is a big
Deputy
factor.
Doherty, I'm going to let the Minister come back to you on that, and then we're going to obviously let you back in.
I'm happy to return to that in the course of the session, but as I've already indicated, we increased both our current and our capital provisioning for the medium term.
Okay. Thank you for your for the first round. Deputy Broughan is next.
Thanks, Gerla. And just welcome the Minister and his colleagues. Just looking at the fiscal monitor, Minister, first of all, I know we don't have June as a non-VAT month, but receipts, I think, were below profile, although they've increased, I think, on 345 million or 4.9% on 2018. But just given the decision that was taken in the budget, which I supported, to go back to the 13.5%, were you disappointed with the VAT take so far? And just a general point then about tax broadening. Obviously, one of our colleagues has mentioned in relation to carbon taxation and so on, perhaps equalising diesel and petrol and other steps that are being considered. But you know, what kind of progress do you think can be made in relation to that? That's just the first thing briefly. And just secondly, the actual, you know, as we get close to this Halloween date, you know, for the third quarter, Minister, I mean, what kind of additional information will you have? You've mentioned we'll have the tax strategy papers, but what kind of further information will be at your disposal, if you like, at the end of September, to enable you, is it the following week then, where you come in with with some kind of a budget? And just on that point, I mean, you're saying that some of the issues in relation to stabilisers and so on, it mitigates the risk of, you know, it mitigates the necessity for a second budget if there's a disorderly Brexit. But I mean, isn't it the case it'll be like 2009? It was 2009 when we had the two budgets at the crash, when Brian Lennon had to come in twice, and Mr. Cowen. I mean, surely, like, we will need a Brexit budget, an emergency budget, if, in actual fact, in other words, your figures, and you've been arguing, or back and forth on some of the elements of what the spending might be, but surely it'll kind of go out the window in terms of the, you know, if there's a national emergency, which it will be, if it's a disorderly Brexit. And just to ask you in terms of our debt, and again a colleague has raised it earlier on, I mean, I think our overall debt has increased by, is it $4.5 billion since 2016. Auntie May obviously has done a good job at refinancing over the last couple of years, but would you anticipate any difficulties if yourself or the next Minister of Finance has to go back to the market to try and finance important current and capital spending? And given the experience, I think that is the Italian government, the Italian Finance Minister has been having recently in relation to bonds, and just the international situation, the overall risk, I suppose. Minister, I noted that one of the two candidates for the leadership of the Tory party He's saying that his definite plan is to introduce a 12.5% corporation tax rate, which of course reminds us of another rate. We have a very volatile president in the United States who's making all kinds of changes in taxation as well. Surely those kind of risks are going to be very profound for 2020 and the early 2020s. Thanks, Carla.
So to deal with the VAT question first, no, I am confident that across the full year our VAT target will be delivered. One of the reasons for that is if we look at what's happening in retail sales at the moment, they're approximately up 4% versus a year ago. And given a strong performance in the retail sector and a continued increase in the number of tourists that are visiting Ireland, I believe it is very, very likely the figure that we will have for the year will be delivered. And if I look at where we are overall in terms of VAT receipts, they currently stand at up 4.9% versus a year ago, which is a good sign as to where I think we will end up across the year. In relation to your question on carbon taxing, I don't have too much more to say beyond that which I said to Deputy Breathnach a moment ago, which is before the summer we'll outline different options regarding how the revenue for that might be recycled if a decision were to be made regarding increasing carbon taxation. In relation to the level of national debt that is there at the moment, do I anticipate challenges in relation to funding additional borrowing if we needed to fund additional borrowing? The Chief Executive of the NTMA answered that question yesterday when he said that he believed it was very likely that that kind of additional borrowing, if needed, could be funded. And one of the key contribution that I will need to make to that as Minister for Finance is explaining what the money would be used for, and then explaining how over time, if we had a deficit, that could be corrected. And then in relation to the 12.5%, if that happens to come in another jurisdiction, I think if that happens, that will be happening in the context of lots of other things happening within their economy in their country that may have an effect on the ability of that country to be competitive. And I think it will be all the more reason for us to be able to show that we are a stable jurisdiction, particularly with respect to a number of particular policy areas. And it's one of the reasons why I believe it's very important to indicate and to ensure that we deliver one budget this year.
But you don't think, as coming up to that first week in October, that there might be an air of unreality about you preparing an orderly Brexit budget?
Well,
I presume like a lot of work is going on in the department and deeper and so on to analyse thoroughly all of the parameters of.
Yes, it is, and we are looking at the different needs that we might have in a disorderly Brexit scenario. And what will be vital is that when Budget 2020 is delivered, it is delivered in a way that is realistic and credible for our citizens and for financial markets. And I believe I will be able to do that.
And you won't have a second budget?
I will not have a second budget.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Deputy Broughan. Next up, I have Deputy John Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister and your officials, for your public service, as usual, and for your willingness to attend regularly here. It's appreciated by the Budgetary Oversight Committee. Some of the questions I wanted to address have been addressed by you, Minister, in fairness. So some short and kind of sweet questions. You state in your opening remarks that we have a well-managed economy and our public finances have been placed on a sustainable trajectory, and you mentioned that word sustainable and sustainability a few times in your speech. In relation to Brexit, you say the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union would have a detrimental impact on our economy and public finances, whatever form it takes. As the preparation for that, I mean, I've often said to you here, I'm not an economist, but, I'm like you, a keen political observer. So Brexit has been characterised by chaos for the last 2 years. Doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that it won't be characterised by anything else but chaos in the short term. That's from observing. Colm McCarthy was here, Stephen Kinsella was here. I think I'm roughly paraphrasing them. I hope I'm not misquoting them, and the chair can tell me if I am. I don't want to be inaccurate. But that, they were asked and responded, if they were in your position, they'd be adopting one budgetary stance. They wouldn't be looking at 2 budgetary stances. And that would be the expectation of a disorderly Brexit. I mean, you've pointed out, it's a question of which form of disorderly it's going to be. So, given, I think you're putting a lot of faith that I'm not sure anybody else has in having some kind of clearer position by September or early October as to where the United Kingdom stands. I'm just wondering, how do you substantiate that position?
Well, the difference, you refer to yourself as a political observer. Of course, you're anything but that, Deputy Lahart. You are a deputy and you are a participant in our political process, as I am. And the difference that you and I have versus the gentleman you referred to a moment ago is they are commenting and analysing on what is happening, and that has a certain level of consequence. But of course, I have to make decisions, and you do too, and that has a far higher level of consequence within our economy and for those who work in our economy. And the difference between an economist, no matter how much I respect that economist, saying that a disorderly Brexit is likely, and the Irish government saying one will happen, are 2 very, very different things. And that is why, at this point in time, with all that is going on, I think it is fair and responsible for us to say that a number of different scenarios could happen, and we'll form a view in December regarding what is the more likely one. And that will have an impact on decisions that we then do in the budget, and the impact in turn will be significant on our national finance indicators. So how will I substantiate that? Well, it's going to be on the basis of engagement that we have within the European Union, and will be on the basis of the engagement that we have with the new British government.
What do you think you might know in September?
We'll know in September at that point what is the actual intention of the leader of the Conservative Party once they take over as Prime Minister, and we might have a clearer view regarding the likely reaction of the European Union to that.
Yeah, that's the bit that puzzles me, I guess, is that and that's the bit, I suppose, that I while accepting your remarks in relation to the role of economists, we'll come back to a point I've often made here, criticism of previous times that we didn't listen to advice that was given. So this is advice from pretty senior people. Because you talked about clarity and the new British Prime Minister, and I just wonder, should you put your eggs in that basket? But anyway, that's the question.
Deputy, if I could just interject, there are an equal number of economists who are commenting on the fact that being clear that we are going to do a single budget is also of value, because if we get into a situation of a disorderly Brexit actually happening across November and December, there is value in both businesses in our country and those we may depend on for support in the future, being clear upon what our budgetary framework is and being clear on what our intentions are. As you will know yourself, if there is if a government is in a scenario of delivering more than one budget, it creates a risk of instability in terms of policies that are likely to be implemented. And I believe it's in our national interest that that not happen to us, and that we are clear on where we stand with the best information that is available to us up to budget day.
Thanks for that. I imagine, as a member of the Budgetary Oversight Committee, that we welcome the idea that you're looking at how we can mitigate a fall at some stage in the future, a reduction in corporation tax, and that you're looking at ways of kind of stress testing that, which would have been advice given here over the last 2 years, because you have spent, I think, something like 14 billion out of the 15.5 billion of windfall corporation tax on current expenditure. Could have those figures slightly wrong, but that's what you've done. Do you accept the need, as put forward by IFAC, for a prudence account, and will that be reflected in this year's budget, in the budget for 2020? And in relation to the carbon tax, you indicated in last year's budget that you would set a trajectory this year for carbon tax. So when you say set a trajectory, does that mean that you will, this budget 2020, will incorporate an actual fiscal measure in relation to carbon tax?
Firstly, in relation to corporation tax, we collected last year €10 billion, approximately €10 billion, not 14 or 15 billion euro. And to say that all of that money, all of the funding that has been collected is windfall funding would not be, I believe, a tenable assessment of it. A lower amount was collected, and while it is certainly a possibility across the coming period that not all of that will be sustainable, to indicate that the vast majority of it won't be sustainable, I don't believe is likely. But in any event, Deputy, this is why we will be going ahead with work within the department, where we will, through working with our colleagues in the Revenue Commissioner, try to form a further view regarding the sustainability of corporation tax receipts into the future. This will be difficult, given work that is underway in the OECD, and decisions that will happen towards the end of next year. But I think it's important that we do it now. And I would make the point that while you are correct, and I have acknowledged that this is a vulnerability that we need to be aware of, that corporation tax funding has been used and has been a contributor to funding supplementaries that were needed. I'd also make the point that a massive increase in capital expenditure has happened since 2014, that corporation tax has enabled, and many commentators on this area would say that you should be using windfall gains to finance increases in capital investment, which is also what has happened in recent years. In relation to your question on carbon taxation, I've already outlined in my last budget and in other public statements my medium-term kind of outlook in relation to where I would like to see carbon taxation go to. And it's on a budget-by-budget basis up to 2030 of €80 a tonne. But I will be waiting until budget day and nearer, and obviously I will be working in conjunction with your own party on this to decide what kind of a change happens in budget 2020.
Final question, thanks, Chair.
Last minute, Chair.
You know, I think the figures I gave you were IFAC, and it wasn't just 1 year's corporation tax, it was over the periods when the unexpected windfall arrived. I think that they mentioned a figure close to 14 billion out of 15.5 billion having been spent on current expenditure. Just one question, maybe it's not in the context of the summer economic statement, but it's a question that came from, or an idea that came from, it was mentioned by Professor Stephen Kinsella in terms of fiscal stress tests, which I think is something that we'll be looking at as a committee. In terms of the national broadband plan, for example, you said that the most expensive part of that, this is my language, would be funded at a time when the surplus would be greatest. Now, we'll just say in the context of a disorderly Brexit, when there would be maybe no surplus, how would you intend to fund major projects like that?
So, in the case of a disorderly Brexit happening, in which case it is possible that our country could then be in a deficit position, and I've outlined the figures for that, a new capital project like the National Broadband Plan would then be funded by part of that deficit, because it's an additional commitment on top of our existing ones. But what I would say then is the context for the National Broadband Plan would then change an awful lot. Because if you look at the analysis that I think this committee has acknowledged, regarding parts of our country who would most adversely be affected by a disorderly Brexit. It tends to focus on those parts of our country and our economy that are outside of our largest cities, and looks at where we are, for example, in the northwest of our country. And of course, they are parts of our country that would benefit the most from the rollout of a national broadband plan. So yes, the national finance background of going ahead with the national broadband plan would change. But then if you're looking at parts of our country that would most adversely be affected by a disorderly Brexit, they're also the parts of our country and our economy that would be most positively affected by the rollout of broadband. Just in relation to your final point, or an earlier point in relation to the 14 to 15 billion euro that we're exchanging views on, and I've no doubt we will establish after the committee, the figure that you're referring to there may also have included debt servicing costs of our national debt. So that may well be the difference between our two figures.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I can't be 100% certain on it, but just from something, just trying to look here, I think the figure you were quoting, Deputy Lahart, is an IBEC figure rather than an IFAC figure. That's from
Stand correct.
You know, it's just from what we could try and find. It might have been mentioned by somebody else as
That
well.
make it wrong?
The next deputy indicating is Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Minister and his officials. Minister, can I go back to the Brexit stuff, please? And we're going to make a decision, I presume late September the decision will be made. And you're saying that it will be made on the basis of the soundings coming from the European Union and discussions with the new leader of the Conservative Party. Is that a fair reflection of what you're saying today?
And we'll have to include our own judgment as well on what's most likely to happen. With the potential of instability abroad, I would have thought it more important to be able to show stability at home in terms of how we are planning our affairs.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have an issue with it having an orderly, disorderly approach to it. I think that's the correct way to do it. But just in relation to actually making the decision at the end of September, and what kind of factors outside of those two factors, kind of getting a sounding from the EU and a sounding from the new leader of the Conservative Party, surely we're looking at other factors that will feed into that decision that you will have to make.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have general feedback from within our economy, but ultimately it's a decision that will be made by the government in relation to what is most likely to happen, and will be political in nature, because the decision to leave the European Union without an agreement is a decision that will be made by the United Kingdom for their reasons. And my suspicion is that as we move throughout the year, and in particular when we move into September, it may be quite evident to us what are the kind of risks that we have to manage. But that will only become clearer, I believe, in the post-summer period.
Okay. And in the event of a disorderly Brexit, and the counter-cyclical kick in, and you've given us the analysis, what's the real effect of that? I mean, what areas will that really affect?
Well, I think when we're using phrases like counter-cyclical, they're phrases that are economic in nature.
Yeah.
You and I will be aware as public representatives what are the effect of this on people's lives.
Yeah.
And both of us understand that. What that means is that we have indicated that across the early years of a disorderly Brexit, were that to happen, it is possible that the level of unemployment in our economy could go up by 2 points. We have also said across that period that the number of people working within our economy won't actually change. It will still remain at a high level, between 2.1 and 2.2 million euro. But we have population growth within our economy. We have more people coming into the labour market. And because of that, we can have an unchanged number of people at work in Ireland, but also see the unemployment rate go up. And that's what we've acknowledged in the summer economic statement. And were that to happen, we would want to ensure then that we have the resources in place to fund our commitments to those citizens. And of course, the other thing that could happen in that scenario, will happen in that scenario, is because of the effect of a disorderly Brexit taking place, we could expect to see a change in our tax revenues, as, for example, consumption and investment has changed as a result of Brexit happening. So we could see two things. We could see our expenditure going up at a time in which our tax revenue begins to change. It's just putting all this in context that while I think a lot of the debate has understandably been to focus on the deficit in cash terms were that to happen, because it would be a figure that in cash terms is big, but that would have to be seen in the context that as a deficit of 1.5% of our national income, it is significantly below than deficits that we have dealt with in our very recent past. That 1.5% figure would compare to a figure of 10.5% or 11% a number of years ago. And I believe that we will have the ability to correct that quickly in the post-Brexit period.
And maybe this is not, well, it's not really a financial question, it's more a policy question, but it's related. In the event of a disorderly Brexit, obviously some sectors of the economy will be impacted more than others. And you may see those increases in unemployment in particular sectors of the economy. What steps are we taking to ensure that those people in those sectors of the economy which will be most impacted will have the opportunity to transition easily? Because one of the big effects of the economic downturn the last time was because we had an over-reliance on the construction sector. And once that went bust, people didn't have the skills or the opportunities to transfer into other sectors of the economy. So what kind of policy or what kind of planning are we doing to try and offset some of those issues which may arise in the event of a disorderly Brexit?
So I think we should also, as we're having a discussion regarding the bad things that might happen in our jobs market and level of employment within our country, should acknowledge this is in the context of a very high level of employment and an economy that's performing really, really well. And if we are approaching a shock like we may have to deal with, to have an economy that is growing quickly and growing in a very diversified way is one of the best ways in which we could approach a period of uncertainty. You could imagine, Deputy, that we would be having a very different debate if we had 8% unemployment in our country and we had an economy that was growing at 1 or 2%. So the first thing that we can do to try to deal with the issue that you're referring to is have an economy that's growing quickly and a high level of employment within our country. That is in place. To deal with your question then regarding what we would do, the first thing we would try to do is work with companies and sectors to try to avoid or minimise employment being shed in the first place before we even begin to engage in the phase that you're referring to. And we will have to work in particular with the agriculture and food sector of our economy to see what can be done there in terms of if employment is shed then and how can we deal with that. We will have to go back to the kind of work that we have done recently, where we look at what is the kind of retraining work that can be done, or we look at how we can have investment in place that's creating other forms of work. And in the debate that we've had so far about what remains to be unallocated, it should be acknowledged that we have €700 million of additional capital investment planned for next year. And that is to deal with the point that you are raising, that if somebody loses their job due to something happening in a company or a particular project, we are generating other forms of economic activity through increasing capital investment that creates the possibility for them to move into another job. And that's what we are aiming to do.
And that's the point I'm making. To move into those other jobs, they may need to upskill.
And they may well need training. Yes, indeed. You're right, Deputy. That may be needed. But during the period from 2013 to 2014 to 2015, my colleagues in the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Education showed that we do have the ability to do that. And while I will work to be in a position that we're minimising employment being shed in the first place, and as I have said, we believe we will still have an economy that will have over 2.1 million people at work. Of course, we will look at what specific supports are needed to support people, if needed, in retraining or reskilling as they look to work in other parts of our economy.
Okay, just two final questions. Obviously, Brexit is a huge issue and it could have a significant impact. Are there other external factors outside of Brexit that we're keeping an eye on, which could really impact on the budgetary position for the next number of years?
The most acute one in the short term is Brexit. In terms of the medium term, it will be what happens with growth within the Eurozone and what happens with the kind of debates that are underway in relation to global tax policy or global trade policy. But they are more medium term in nature. We have seen a lot of charged words in relation to global trade, but we are still seeing economies in America in particular that are growing, and our trade with them is growing too. But I would see all of those as being probably more medium-term challenges, whereas Brexit is very much a short-term one.
Okay. Just in relation to the expenditure reserve of 200 million for the National Children's Hospital and broadband, that's been allocated for 2020. We have no further allocation then for the subsequent years. Are we saying that we're going to make that decision on a year-by-year basis, or are we just saying the 200 million for 2020 and nothing further will be needed in the subsequent years?
No, we have increased our capital profiling from 2021 onwards to deal with the cost of the National Broadband Plan. So that has happened because the cost of that is known with a degree of clarity per year.
So that's built in already?
That's built in. In relation to the National Children's Hospital, the 2020 cost of that is accounted for through the expenditure reserve that we have in place for 2021. In relation to, for 2020, excuse me, in relation to the cost of the National Children's Hospital beyond that, for 21 to 2022, that is not accounted for in a higher capital ceiling, but you'll see in row D and box 5, there is a high level of unallocated funding for those 2 years, which would then deal with the funding of the further post-2020 cost for the National Children's Hospital.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Deputy O'Brien. Deputy Heydon.
Thanks, Chair, and thank the Minister and his officials for coming in before us on what is a very important topic. Minister, it's been mentioned at a committee about the productivity levels in the construction sector, something I've talked to you about before in relation to our ambitious plans around the National Development Plan. I'm mindful of the fact that a construction sector group was established by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to look at the productivity challenges in the construction sector. Have you any update for the committee on the work of this group and any of the outcomes of its work so far?
Yes, I mean the key area that we're working on is the development of a project in relation to building information management, what's called BIM, and what this is developing computer modelling of big projects that are due to be delivered, and using this to try to reduce the cost of that project then when it actually goes to be built. On page 35 of the Summer Economic Statement, we also outline other things that are being done in relation to us. And probably the main area that we are looking at the moment is what can be done to increase the level of skill within the construction sector at the moment to in turn influence the level of productivity. The work that we have done would indicate that productivity levels for construction are 24% below the European average at the moment here in Ireland. And affecting that and improving that is one of the ways in which we will address the output of that sector.
Okay, thanks for that. The Summer Economic Statement raises awareness of the implications of a hard Brexit, but in relation to other external threats to the economy, are they being factored in, particularly I think of the likes of issues around trade. So we have President Trump's comments yesterday regarding potential view of trade with the EU into the future, and maybe, I know Mercosur it's in the news at present, it's a longer term element, but do you see challenges or possibilities in the area of trade, and when you think of the challenges that will happen to trade if in a disorderly Brexit? Maybe you might have a comment to make on that.
Yes, I do, but and this is the reason why, if you have a look at the growth outlook that we have for our economy, what we are doing is changing that growth outlook over time, and we're indicating that over time we will have an economy that will grow more around the 3% figure, 2.5% to 3%, as opposed to the far higher rates of growth that we have seen in our recent past. Just to make the point that if the economy is growing at 2.5% to 3%, that would still be a level of economic growth that, if sustained over time, has the ability to make a hugely positive impact on living standards within our economy, and would be ahead of the long-term average of growth in Ireland.
Okay. The Stability Programme update outlines a reduction in the gross debt of 8.4 billion in 2020. How realistic is this?
In terms of the level of reduction of our
gross debt?
I think it can certainly be achieved, Deputy, if we move into a position where we are running surpluses. That can have a very big effect on the level of debt that we have in our economy as a percentage of national income. But the key thing is that for that level of surplus to be sustained over time. Yeah.
Okay. And then finally, Chair, just look, the committee has heard much commentary regarding the economy approaching full capacity, and that we could be heading into a period of overheating, as has been touched on here. And obviously a disorderly Brexit would stop that happening. But in terms of overall strategy for the economy, if it does overheat, do you accept the fact that we potentially could be facing full capacity, or do you believe there's ability to grow capacity within the economy further? What possibilities are there about trying to grow capacity rather than just accepting that we need to put brakes on to maintain potential poor cold water?
Yeah, I think in the context if Brexit were not to happen, or if it were to be an orderly Brexit, or if it were to happen at a later point in time, the two things that we would then need to look at would be how we can improve the capacity of the people, of the capital, of the land that is present here in our country. It would not be all about how do we restrain growth. It would be also about how do we make better use of the resources that are available to us. I think in particular the main opportunity that we would have there would be in relation to the level of underemployment that we still have in particular parts of our country, and that's why the work that Minister Sapone is doing in the National Childcare Plan, I believe, is important for social and economic reasons. And then the use of land would be then even more important, and that's why I believe the work of the Land Development Agency over time can make a difference. So it would have to be a mixture of two things. It would be making more of what we have, while also be careful that we are not putting in place decisions that are likely to stimulate any further inflation within the economy.
Okay. If I could actually ask...
you still have some time.
One further question. Thanks for the answer on that. I suppose we've seen a difficult number of months where your department is dealing with a number of pressures on the public sector pay side and demands from that side, whether it's our defence forces, whether it's HSE staff and beyond. In broad macro terms, how key is the public sector stability agreement to our future economic growth, and any comments you have on that?
It's crucial. How we manage public sector pay is the single largest section of total current expenditure. Any change in our public sector wage bill that affects everybody else in our public service has a really, really big effect on the total level of current expenditure within our economy. In terms of the issues and debates that we are having to date, for example, there is one currently underway now in the Labour Court at the moment, just to acknowledge that, and work underway in relation to healthcare assistance. All I will say is that in relation to our current agreement, as we approach halfway through the 3-year agreement, the changes and payments that we have made, that we are making available to the vast majority of our public servants, are unchanged versus what we assumed inside that agreement. So we, when we were putting together this agreement, assumed a certain level of wage increase on certain timings, outside of the changes that we are due to make with those who are nurses. And this is why the new nursing contract will be so important. The changes that we have made with everybody else are planned and inside the planned budgetary parameters.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Now I'm going to, on order of indication, go back to some deputies for a second set of questions. I had Deputy Breathnach who'd indicated there.
Thanks, Chairman. I normally don't come in a second then, but I omitted to ask this question. Obviously, the economists that we've met here in committee, and indeed AFAC, I think, and the Fiscal Council indicated the importance that we be, I suppose, proactive rather than reactionary in the event of a disorderly Brexit. I suppose, Minister, the question clearly needs answering as to whether the various plans are in place in terms of EU support packages for the various sectors that are going to be most impacted, and whether we are in a state of readiness to deliver those packages should a disorderly Brexit happen. And I mean, if I might just instance, for example, more recently the 100 million package in relation to the beef sector, it hasn't filtered down despite the fact it was committed to. And if that were to happen in relation to not having the plans in place for the supports from EU, it would be disastrous if 6 months down the road that disorderly Brexit happened and packages didn't kick in. Can you assure this committee that in that event of having to take that fork in the road of a disorderly Brexit, that the best laid plans are deliverable in terms of the vulnerable sectors?
Yes, they are deliverable, and we will ensure that we can put the strongest support that is possible in place for sectors that would be affected by a disorderly Brexit. However, this is support that over time would need to be capable of being phased out, because we will have to ensure that those parts of our economy that we are supporting turn maybe to other sectors or to other countries, or make changes within their companies and sectors so that they become sustainable again. And even with the kind of support that we would want to put in place, I still want to be clear that a disorderly Brexit happening, as we have outlined in the summer economic statement, would pose very considerable difficulties for our economy. And while we will do what can be done to help our economy respond back to that, it will still mean very considerable change in terms of the ability of our country to trade, the key reason being because of the nature of the change in the trading relationship that we will have with the UK.
Just finally, can you assure me that the packages are in place and that there will be no delay in the sectors that will be greatest impacted, and that there is an assurance from the EU to that effect?
I can assure you that supports will be in place if they are needed, and also from my engagement with the European Union, I am confident that they will provide the policy guidance or a recognition that is needed to do that. But of course we will be expected to, and we will be able to, provide the resource ourselves to respond back to this challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Doherty.
Minister, I want to just focus in on a couple of points, but starting with the health spending. So if we're looking at the latest fiscal monitor at the end of June, we see the overall gross current expenditure was up 6.8 higher than 2018. This is compared to what was projected for, which is 5.8%. At the end of May, it was 8.9% higher than what was projected, or 8.9 higher than the previous year. Again, what was projected was 5.8. So how concerned are you, Minister, that we are going to see a health overrun in 2019?
I think if there were to be a health overrun of the magnitude of what we saw last year, it would be a matter of very great concern to me. And as the figures indicate at the moment, Deputy, we are in a better place than we were a year ago from an expenditure management point of view, but there is still a risk that will require ongoing focus for the rest of the year.
The government is anticipating that the relative growth in expenditure for 2019 will peak in May, and then you'll have two months of decline and then stability for the rest of the year. I think that's a fair analysis in terms of what the government are projecting in health. Now, that's the complete opposite to what we've seen last year, and indeed the trends in health spending, where we have indications of an overrun in the middle of the year. At the minute, it's the overrun, if you were to project even just the current level out to the end of the year, it would be 150 million. But the trends have always been that there's significant increase in the last quarter. Why do you believe that 2019 will buck the trend in relation to health overspend?
Okay, so do you mean in terms of the profiling of a deputy, in terms of what will happen towards the end of the year?
Yeah, the actual overspend. So the overspend.
Sure. So two reasons why. The first one is because of the magnitude of additional funding that was supplied to our health services last year. Because of the magnitude of the supplementary estimate last year, in addition to the additional funding in Budget 2019, that funding is just over €1 billion, which is the largest increase in funding to the health services in a single year out of the different budgets that I have been involved in. In relation to the point that you make regarding the profiling for the rest of the year, it is a risk that I am aware of. While I am arguing that we will be better able to manage this because of the very significant amount of additional funding that was received last year, the key metric that I look at is growth in current spending versus previous year by month versus what we have budgeted for the entire year, and where we are from a profiling point of view I look at, but it's secondary to that. And that is the best indicator for me as to the level of risk that we may have.
Okay, so if we look at May, for example, May showed a growth of expenditure at 8.9. Last year it was 9.5. So there's not a huge difference in relation to May. Now, we've seen a decrease in terms of June, but the indications will all point to, if we are seeing a significant overrun at this point in time, which is 1% above what was budgeted for, that will accelerate in the last quarter of the year. Like it's regardless of the amount that was allocated last year, the HSE and the health spend are saying to us at this point that they cannot, or they have not been able to stay within their means in the first 5 months of the year, and the trends always are a sharp increase in the last quarter. I don't understand. Are you suggesting that there won't be a sharp increase?
I'm not suggesting that at the moment. What I am saying is this is something that we need to avoid happening, and that's why I'm being very careful in my analysis of where we are at the moment. The change that happened in June is in marked contrast to where we were in May. Across earlier parts of the year, the growth in our expenditure versus the previous year was inside what we had budgeted for. But it is obvious to me, as it is the month-on-month expenditure earlier on in the year was in line with what we had budgeted for. That changed in May and changed downwards again in June. So I am being very clear that while the June figures in terms of current expenditure growth versus what we have budgeted for is showing progress in managing the risk, I'm equally clear that in the second half of the year, myself and Minister Harris will need to work together to ensure that we deliver our commitments to patients, but that it is inside the parameters that we have agreed with the HSC and Department of Health.
Okay, so it's obviously not within the parameters at the minute because there is an overrun. There's an overrun.
There is an increase in this, yes. So as we are at this point in the year, the figure is higher, but as against that, two things. Firstly, the growth in expenditure that we have in June is now lower than where it was versus May.
But still above budget.
I'm accepting that, but the magnitude by which it is above budget is far smaller than it has been in other years.
Yeah, but if you were, okay, so you believe, but it's still running, if you run that out, even at the lower level of June, if you run that out for the year, we're €150 million over budget. So is your view that we will see continually them coming in budget and bucking the trend of every other year?
I am aiming and will be working to get them within budget, and what is different to where we have been in other years is the magnitude of additional funding they got last year. It was just over €1 billion deputy.
And what does that mean? Because, I'm very conscious of anybody who watches these committees that, like we're talking about highline figures and stay within budget, and the importance of that is well known. But what does that mean for people? Like, I met with the HSC last weekend. They've told me that there's 250 people in Donegal that have been approved home help packages. 250 people that aren't getting them because of the direction that they can't provide, they can't meet the needs of the public because your demands that they stay within the resources that were allocated to them. They tell me that they said straight away when they got the resources allocated in the last year that it's impossible to deliver a service with the amount of resources that they were provided. And there's a number of factors with that. Home helps, for example, the transport cost was now factored in, so it wasn't face time that was being delivered. That's 1,000 hours, and that's just them after implementing 1,000 hours per week. That's just them implementing. They're putting a freeze on allocating home help hours till the end of August, and then they're going to review it. Now, I could go down to personal stories about the 90-year-old woman living alone, rural Donegal, approved 3 months ago for a home care package, won't get it. So what does that mean? Does it mean operations cancelled, or have you identified waste within the HSC that can be filleted out, or is it just a case of procedures being suspended or cancelled?
No, I'm well aware of the people that are behind this. I'm well aware of the patients and citizens that we impact by decisions that are made. I deal with them in my own constituency, as you do. But as you point to what is happening within Donegal and a constituent that you've met, I'd also point to the fact that for this year now, there are 53,000 of our citizens who will benefit from home support services, and a further 235 that will benefit from, because they need these services, intensive home care packages, which is an increase from where we were last year. So what I am indicating here, and I'm indicating my full support for Paul Reid and the work that he is doing within the HSE, is that we have the ability to grow services. We have the ability to deliver home help hours that are needed, but we have to ensure that the budgetary parameters that we have, that those services are conscious of that. And with the level of funding that is now available to the HSE, that can be done. And the reason why it's so important that that happen is because if we don't do this, two things will happen. Firstly, other public services decisions that are going to be made by other government departments will be impacted. And the second thing that will happen is we will end up funding higher and higher amounts of public services in the future of tax revenue that we might not be sure we will always have. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm confident inside the money that is available to the HSE and to the Department of Health, and in supporting the work of Paul Reid, that we can meet the needs that patients have, as the 53,000 people who are availing of our home care services demonstrate.
Minister, you're living in Cloud Cuckoo Land. No, let me say this. You're living in Cloud Cuckoo Land. You need to come down and listen to what I'm saying, but more importantly, listen to what the people are saying. You're sitting there saying you're confident that we can deliver the need of patients. I'm telling you, the HSE has told you, there are patients which needs have been assessed by the HSE. They have said they need this support, they need this care. The HSE is saying, you need it, but we can't provide it.
because if we provide it, we will go over budget. We cannot go over budget. So that's what I'm asking in terms of what does this mean? Do you have some magical way that doesn't involve people who need home care support not being denied it, or operations which we're likely to see being cancelled or delayed later on because the resources are not available?
Deputy, I'm in the same world as you, representing similar constituents with similar needs. And I'm as aware as you are of the level of need that is there for those patients who are in our hospitals or who want to go into our hospitals or our primary care centres. So I understand exactly the reality that you're referring to, because I represent and deal with the same issues myself. But in so doing, I'm also making the point to you that if you look at home support services at the moment, the additional funding for home support services has grown by €140 million over the last 4 years. That is a really significant increase to ensure that we're putting in place the resources that are needed to respond back to the issues that you are referring to.
Minister, look, the point here is you're saying that you believe that we can meet the needs of the public. I'm saying, how are we going to do that? Because the needs of the public aren't being met at this point in time. That's the reality. Like, do you accept that there are thousands of people who have been assessed just looking at this one item? And we could look at many items. We could look at other issues in terms of delays and so on and so forth in operations. But on this item, that there are thousands of people whose needs have been assessed that cannot be met as a result of budgetary constraints at this point in time. And if you have some way, because the Taoiseach told us that he was going to examine this issue and dig deep into the figures, if you have some way that you believe that those needs can be met within the existing resources, please tell us. Because the HSE are telling us that they told you last year when the budget was allocated, because there is an increased budget, but the transport time of all of the home care support, and rightly so, is now factored in. So there was an increase needed anyway. There was an increase in terms of demographics, and the need has exceeded what the budget is there.
Okay. And I am aware of the level of unmet need that is there, which is why the HSE and the Department of Health are looking to make use of the resources that they have available to them and find out if there's different ways they can be used to meet the issues that you're referring to. But as we are debating the needs that are unmet or need to be met, and I'm aware of waiting lists, I'm aware of families and citizens awaiting services after assessment, I'm also making the point to you that we're currently providing those services to 53,000 citizens at the moment, and the resources and funding are in place to do that. And you are as aware as I am, and in fact you acknowledged it yourself earlier on, that there are budgetary parameters. There is a need for services to be funded from the money that is made available to them. And we've had a huge increase in the level of funding that's been made available to the health service.
Thank you. Boyd Barish.
Minister, that's Freudian slip there, sorry. Isn't there a sort of circle that can't be squared here, following on from Deputy Doherty's point, is that there are needs that are quite simply not being met. And I accept that you're getting the same representations as all of us are, of people who have been approved for home care packages, not getting them, and they're told quite simply it's not in budget, and really you're not providing an answer as to how we're going to provide for those needs, other than to say some needs are being provided for. But the fact of the matter is huge amounts aren't. I met with hospital consultants today and they were talking about gynecological care, 30,000, 20 or I can't remember the figures, 20,000 I think people waiting for gynecological care, essentially can't be met because we don't have enough doctors. And their argument, at least, is that we can't recruit the consultants because of the two-tier pay for consultants, new entrants, just not willing to work beside people where they're getting paid. I think they say 57% less than somebody else who just happened to become a consultant before 2012, and they just think this is obnoxious. I'm not doing this, I'm leaving the country, and they're just leaving. Housing, you could make a similar point about. You can say, well, we're ramping up housing. There's more social housing being built, but it's not enough. To take just one example of the affordable housing, right, which just hasn't delivered, and I don't even think you could argue that on the affordable housing, just nothing is being delivered, and the little that is being delivered, it looks as if maybe unaffordable. We were talking to the NDFA, and they were explaining that because of the particular way the affordable scheme is set up, that that what is affordable is being based on site-specific costs, market conditions, and so on. So they end up with affordable housing being cost rental housing being €1,200 a month, which is not affordable for somebody on average industrial earnings or less. Just not affordable. Now, the only way you can resolve that is by the state putting in a bigger subsidy or extending out the finance time. But these things are being dictated by budgets. So we're just not meeting the need. And there's lots of other examples you could go through in terms of infrastructure, climate action. So my question really to you is 700 million anywhere near enough to meet the current expenditure requirements and capital expenditure requirements we would need to actually address these problems? Because I put it to you, it's just not enough. And that the only way you can resolve this dilemma is by raising extra revenue. Because I do agree with you, and I disagree with some of my colleagues in the opposition who think borrowing is the way forward. I'm not for running deficits. I'm not for borrowing. In fact, I find it shocking that we've paid €60 billion out in debt repayments over the last 10 years. 60 billion. That's 3 national children's hospitals a year. It's just unbelievable. And it's we've almost forgotten about that discussion. Right? Huge black hole in the economy in terms of debt. Most toxic debt, in my opinion, that we shouldn't be repaying. But either way, it's shocking. So don't we have to look at finding extra sources of revenue, right, to increase the envelope that is available for us? And would that not lead you, I mean, you're never going to go as far as we would, right? But do you not think we need to start looking at profits, capital taxes, wealth taxes, employers' PRSI, sources like that where we could increase significantly? And tax expenditures. And this is just to conclude my question, tax expenditures. You see this huge scrutiny of direct expenditure. There's very little of tax expenditures, but they amount to billions of tax giveaways, mostly to the wealthy and to the big corporations, and there is no scrutiny of them at all. We've started the process in this committee, but we're a hell of a long way from where it needs to go in terms of examining these huge tax expenditures, which, if that money was redirected into direct expenditure in the areas of need that we've just identified, we might actually be able to meet some of these demands that are building up on us.
And I guess the key difference between the two of us, Deputy, is you're having a look at the €700 million that's unallocated. Yeah. I'm aware of the fact that for next year our planned budget expenditure is €68.8 billion. So we're having a debate about what is unallocated. I'm focused in on the totality of what we are going to spend next year. And given the height of that figure, just under €69 billion, I do believe it gives us the ability to make progress on many of the needs that we are debating here today. Could that figure be grown further by increasing tax in some areas? In theory, it could, and I say in theory carefully, because this is where we will differ now. If you look at, for example, increasing our ability to spend more via reducing the tax expenditures that you're referring to, my argument back to you is decreasing some of those tax expenditures will have other effects in our economy. So, for example, an issue that you and I have debated before is the research and development tax credit. Yeah. You see that as a tax credit that benefits, that trickles up to the wealthy. I see the R&D tax credit, and I've direct experience from this, as being a credit that plays an important role in the retention and the development of employment within our economy. And I believe the theory of what you are advocating is very logical, and I've always acknowledged that you put forward very consistent propositions. But where I differ with you on is the tax raising measures that you're referring to, I believe would have a very negative effect on our economy.
You can very briefly just respond to the Minister, but you are just over time.
Okay, well, just very briefly in response to that, I mean, we all know that the R&D tax credit is overwhelmingly benefiting a small number of big multinational corporations who are paying pitiful levels, often below 1% tax. Are you seriously suggesting that if we redirected some of that towards our public universities, for example, which might help deal with some of our labour shortages and skills shortages, that all the multinationals are going to run out of the country when they're paying less than 1% of tax? Like, I just don't buy that. Now, you could argue if we lashed it up to 20% effective rate, maybe it would have an impact. That is a debate. I don't think it's a serious proposition to say we could redirect or close down some of those loopholes and redirect them. And I did ask about employers'
Thank you, Deputy.
PRSI.
I'm going to ask you to
employers' PRSI,
because we have a constraint of just under 10 minutes now to the use of this room. So, Minister, if you could respond very briefly there.
Yes, I do believe that changes in things like the R&D tax credit and changes in our corporate tax policy, if we would go down the path that you want us to go down, Deputy, I do believe that would have a very negative effect on the level of employment and investment that we have in our economy. And I say that as somebody who is involved in the forefront of representing what Ireland's competitive offering to companies who create employment here in Ireland. And that is the area of difference between the two of us. And if you're ever Minister for Finance or Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation, and you are responsible for retaining jobs that we have or trying to get more and competing with many of the countries who are trying to do that, you may well experience the reality that I see every day. So I differ with you on that. You touched there on employers' PRSI. It's worthwhile acknowledging that later on in the year there will be a consultation paper in relation to the level of employers' PRSI that we have in our economy to ensure and look at options for how our social insurance fund can meet future commitments that we will have. But where you and I are in very different places is much of what you are advocating, I believe, would have a very damaging effect on our ability to retain jobs and investment in Ireland.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Deputy. I know that Deputy Doherty wants to come back in, but I just want to ask one specific area myself, which I wanted to just tease out with you for a couple of minutes. We had contribution from, particularly to the committee, from IBEC. And in that, I think to say they were what they would see as absolutely trumpeting, not just sounding an alarm, their fears and worries in relation to the whole OECD-led reforms of the taxation in relation to corporation tax, in relation to our taxation system, effectively stating that it was the nearly, and again without wanting to misquote them, the bigger threat to our economic prosperity. Now, you in your answer to questions earlier were characterising these type of changes as a medium-term threat and not comparable with Brexit. They effectively were nearly, I won't say reversing that, but they were certainly highlighting it. I'm interested to hear in terms of where your thinking, the government's thinking, is on how these changes that are being pushed for at international level in terms of corporation tax structure will impact on the next couple of years of budget planning in this country.
Yeah, my view on that is formed by the phasing in relation to what will happen in the OECD. The work plan in relation to the debate on global corporate taxation is not due to be concluded until the end of this year, and decisions in relation to that are not due to be completed until the end of next year. So it's for those reasons that I see Brexit as being a more imminent risk. In terms of the effect that it will have in the medium term on our tax revenues and competitiveness, Change is coming. I made this clear in a speech that I gave at an international tax conference in Dublin Castle a number of weeks ago. There are changes underway, driven by larger countries in particular, who want to look at the way in which global tax policy is conducted. That's why I believe it is so important that if external circumstances allow, we move into a surplus position and begin to grow that surplus over time. As to whether it is going to be a threat to our prospects, at this point in time it's difficult to form a definitive view on that. The reason for that is that the effect that it could have on us will be what are the trade-offs between taxing where value is created. If that is maintained, that shows the ability of our corporate tax over time to stay at levels that it is at or even grow, versus decisions that are made regarding where tax is levied. And it's the trade-off between both of those two elements that will determine the net effect on our corporate tax take. And it is simply too early for anyone to be able to say where that will end up, which is why in the interim we need to make changes like we did on VAT, like we did on stamp duty, and be in a surplus position in our national finances.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'm conscious I had indicated to Deputy Doherty that I would let him back in for a final question there. So, Deputy Doherty.
Can I ask, I'll ask all three together if that's okay. On tax, you answered a parliamentary question to me that you received the report last year on merging PRSI and the USE. Obviously the USE brings in €3.9 billion of tax revenues per annum, which if it's merged with the PRSI would be locked into the insurance fund and it could only be used for those purposes. It doesn't appear anywhere in your projections in terms of this report, because that would leave a gap. Is it still on the table? Why is it taking it so long to actually produce something in relation to produce a map? The second part of the tax is just to clarify, because we're well used to budget day surprises about additional close to €1 billion being found from somewhere. We had the Taoiseach, as was mentioned, saying that there will be a €600 million tax package in this year's budget, and he will still have €3 billion to spend. Now, I don't know where he's getting the other €800 million from. Is he just picking these numbers from the sky, or does he know something that the rest of us don't know? In relation to Brexit, the impact of a disorderly Brexit, which we all want to avoid, over a 5-year period is €28.5 billion to the Irish economy. Yet in option B, all you outline is that we will borrow to deal with the deficit, which obviously we would have to, that deficit of close to €5 billion. But in terms of the stimulus and the mitigation, the support mechanisms, all you're outlining is that the €700 million that's available, and there's questions whether all of it will be available, but that would be used to help support areas. Obviously that is not enough, and there is no plan or indication in relation to what has been outlined. The third point I would like to ask you is in relation to the first question I was asking you earlier on today, was trying to get to this point about unallocated resources in terms of the increase, the increase in expenditure headline numbers that you have allocated for 2021 and out. Now, sometimes it's very confusing to read through the documents, and sometimes the documents, there may be minor errors in them. But if I look at the Stability Programme Update 2019 on page 29, under General Government Expenditure, it tells me the resources that aren't allocated. So, for example, 2020, it tells me that there's 605 million. In the Summer Economic Statement, it's 700 million, so that's closely aligned. The following year, in April's statement, it was 1.3. Here it's 1.9, which shows an increase. But then in the subsequent years, the Summer Economic Statement shows a significant decrease in unallocated resources. And I'm just trying to figure out how that could be, given that you've said that you've increased the amount of expenditure in the Summer Economic Statement. So if you could explain to me, and maybe the best thing to do would be if you could provide the committees with the figures which correspond with the draft Stability Programme update in relation to the magnitude of expenditure that is being increased to reach that 0.25% expenditure level that's outlined in the Summer Economic Statement.
So, thank you. So, in relation to have I factored in the effect of a merger between USC and PRSI into my tax take for the medium term? No, I have not, because a consequence of a merger, were we to fold USC into PRSI, is that there would be an expectation that the tax flow coming from the USC would then be moving into the Social Insurance Fund. That would create a deficit in my tax revenue. So that is not factored in to the figures that you have. In relation to your second question...
But is it going to happen? You've had the report since December. Like, is this just? It was first abolished, the USC. I think you held the placards as well. Then it was merged, the
Deputy
USC.
Doherty, if you can just let the Minister answer.
It is something, Deputy, that I do want to make progress on. But my ability to make progress on in this year's budget is going to be influenced by what kind of Brexit risk I think we're going to face.
Take the Brexit argument.
No,
this was promised 3 years ago.
Sorry, Deputy Doherty.
Yes,
abolish first.
Sorry, Deputy Doherty, let the Minister answer.
Deputy,
very convenient, Minister.
Deputy Doherty.
Deputy, I'm speaking to the man who, for many years, the answer to every question regarding how you were going to raise additional money was a wealth tax. And I don't hear you speak about that anymore.
No, we agree for a wealth tax.
I haven't heard you advocate that in quite a while. And I think it is entirely... I think Deputy Boyd Barrett is still advocating.
You obviously don't read our alternative submissions.
Sorry, can I ask everybody to let the Minister...
The Deputy might be encouraged or worried to know how often I do read the Sinn Féin
obviously you're not reading that part of it.
And I don't recall the wealth tax making an appearance recently.
Oh, it has, and every year I will send you a new copy. And I will even highlight the point for you. I will even highlight the point.
It's only very fair for me to say, I'm answering your question, that any decision that I make in relation to a merger between the two of them, as we move into the October period, my key concern could be how I protect future tax take. And I think it's understandable that I would say that. In relation to what the Taoiseach has said regarding our ability to cut taxes in the future,
and spend $3 billion
it is explicable if you look at it into two different scenarios that we have referred to. In an orderly Brexit scenario, which is outlined there in Table 6, Table 6 does advocate and does show the ability to make progress in delivering a budget surplus, and inside the unallocated resources that are there, which start at €1.9 billion in 2021 and moved to €2.3 billion in 2024,
and there's no...
how it is possible within that to allocate €600 million per year for tax reform
and still spend $3 billion.
And the reason...
$800 million short.
Deputy Doherty, please.
Chairman, I well know that every time I answer one of Deputy Doherty's questions, he wants to interrupt me with a further
I'm interested to hear how he's going to get the $3 billion spent.
The reason why the €3 billion spend can be made is because, of course, that refers to unallocated decisions and unallocated reserves. Baked into the 2021 figures onwards is, of course, the fact there would be pre-committed expenditure that will be growing. That explains the point that has been made. That explains the point that has been made.
Figures are here in black and white.
In relation
€2.2 billion.
In relation, I've answered the Deputy's question, and he knows that I have. In relation to the difference between stability programme updates and the summer economic...
Just for a second, Deputy Doherty. It's not a Punch and Judy show for you, right?
But so look, the Minister
have the respect for the committee and the respect for both yourself and the Minister to allow him reply to you, because he sat and listened to you, to be fair. That's all I ask you to do, Deputy, is to allow him reply.
I will, Chair, and you're very fair, and this is the third time I've come in, and we're scheduled to meet till 4:30, but this is a Budgetary Oversight Committee, and the Minister is putting inaccurate figures on the record here, and we would not be doing our job as supposedly a serious committee if we weren't saying that what the Minister is saying. There is no €3 billion available to spend if you cut taxes by €600 million, unless you raise taxes somewhere else.
You have plenty of time to make that
point. That's the reality. The Minister knows it.
The Minister will
he needs to try.
We're going to let the Minister reply, Deputy Doherty, to you. Thank you, Minister.
I am well used to Deputy Doherty wanting to shout over and make points that I make. because what I'm doing is I'm responding back to each of the questions I raised, and I'm also doing all of this in the context of seeing an economy which, for example, yesterday we only saw is moving to unemployment levels that are approaching economy at full employment, while see earnings grow within our economy that are making a real difference to people's living standards. I know why Deputy Doherty doesn't want to refer that or debate to that, but I am, of course, because I'm in front of the Budget Oversight Committee, happy to answer the different questions that are put to me. And what I have said and what I'm explaining is outlined in Table 6, which shows in the context of unallocated resources that are available from 2021 onwards, the ability for tax reform or reduction packages of €500 to €600 million to be delivered each year.
Thank you.
Can I ask on a point? I think it's really important, and because see what the Minister has just said at the end there, I accept that completely. But the key question is, if he does that, or if you do that, how can you spend an additional €3 billion on top of that? You know, I know, your officials know, every person in this committee knows, you can't do that. You would be left with €2.2 billion at the most, and that is what is outlined in Table 6. Now, you could just acknowledge that instead of, you know, taking us off in distractions in terms of wealth tax and all the rest. But maybe the other questions that I've asked you in terms of Brexit and the preparedness for Brexit, you might want to answer them, and also in relation to unallocated resources and the corresponding figures in the SPU, which I think would be better if you or your officials provided that information to the committee.
Well, I mean, I could understand.
Minister for a final reply on this.
Chairman, I could understand why the Deputy wants to be dismissive of the answers that I put to him, because I am answering his questions, and I'm doing so in the context of an economy that is growing, in which we are increasing investment in, and which is making a difference to the lives of people and their living standards. And while, of course, there are needs that need to be met, the Deputy will never acknowledge any of the progress that is being made in responding to issues of the lives of the people that I and he represent. And I go back to the point that I make. If you have a look at the unallocated column, plus if you have a look at what is pre-committed in terms of expenditure, the ability is there to make progress on the issues that you are referring to.
No.
Now, in relation to
€3 billion plus 600.
in relation to the other points the deputies put to me, if you just want to remind me amidst all of your questions what the question is on Brexit, I'll answer that. But I'm going to ask Mr. Canaan here just to answer the question in relation to the SPU and the SCS and the difference, so we give the deputy the full answer.
So the question on Brexit was, given the impact of €28.5 billion over 5 years, obviously there will be a need to borrow if we have a disorderly Brexit. We would support that to make up the deficit. But your plan B is just to use the resources, the unallocated resources of €700 million to stabilise the economy. We will need more supports than that in relation. There is no plan set out fiscally in relation to what to do in the context of a €28.5 billion hit to our economy, and I think it's a huge deficiency in the summer economic statement. While I wouldn't expect a line-by-line item, there is no fiscal plan to actually deal with this. Like, counter-cyclical approach means, as we know, downturn, you stimulate. You're suggesting that there's nothing to stimulate here.
Firstly, we have baked into our pre-committed plans additional capital expenditure of €700 million, which would be the kind of stimulus that would be needed if our economy was to move into a shock or have to deal with the consequence of a disorderly Brexit. That's already pre-planned in the context of capital expenditure for this year going up by 24%. And as I indicated to Deputy McGrath earlier on, if we do find ourselves in a having to deal with the risks of a disorderly Brexit occurring, when we move into that period in September, I will look at whether further funding is needed to deal with the effects of supporting change in parts of our economy. And we have looked to accommodate that into the deficit span for 2020 that you see. And then Mr. Canaan.
Chair, in relation to Table 10 in the SPU, it follows the format set out in in Budget 2019 and also in the expenditure report for 2019. So we have an amount of 605 million unallocated, as showing as resources not allocated. Now, there are carryover costs of approximately 300 million that are included within the expenditure pre-commitments that we've detailed of 1.2 on the current expenditure side. But as these carryover costs are not specifically allocated to ministerial expenditure ceilings, they are included within that resources not allocated number. So if you remove that 300 million of pre-commitments, that gives you the 0.3 billion of unallocated expenditure for 2020. Then as we move out across the years, what Table 10 in the SPU does is accumulates the unallocated expenditure amount for each year. So back at budget time last year, and in the SPU, we had unallocated resources of 0.7 for 2021, which gives you the 1.3 billion. Now that compares to the 1.3 billion for 2021 in the SES. And the reason for the uplift here is that the average, when you apply a 3.25% growth rate, you get an annual growth in expenditure of roughly 2 billion, as opposed to about 1.5 billion annual growth in expenditure set out in the SPU. So consequently, there's an uplift in the resources not allocated, but these are annual numbers as opposed to the cumulative numbers in the SPU.
Okay, so we're not comparing like for like because there's accumulation. Is it possible for, with the help to actually provide the figures from the SPU based on Table 6 of the unallocated, Section D, which is the unallocated ABC, to show the corresponding figures so that we can see clearly the increase on allocation to reach the 3.25 target?
Yes, it is, and we're going to be publishing our mid-year expenditure report in the next fortnight, and I'll make sure that report contains that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Deputy Boyd Barrett, I know you wanted to also come back in briefly for a question.
I did. Okay, we had the discussion about, why you think the sort of measures I would propose would have the multinationals running for the hills and all that. But one question I'd have is, in previous sort of pre-budget documentation, you did provide figures on and a sort of sectoral breakdown of profits and their increases. I wonder, do you have those figures? Because they're not in any of the documents I've seen beforehand. And I think it would be useful for us to know, and indeed for the public to know, how much profits have increased and give a sectoral breakdown of that over recent years. Because it's very difficult to sort of judge your budgetary decisions, particularly for ordinary people, unless we know how everybody's doing relative to one another in the economy. So I'd ask that as a question. Do you have, because they were previously given, I remember in previous years we had graphs and everything showing, transport, profits up this much, construction up this much, IT up this much. So I don't expect you to have them now, but I would love it if your department had them, because I think we deserve to know, right? But broadly, would you accept that profits have increased by a very significant margin more than wages and salaries over the last few years? And that while that continues to be the case, that the benefits of economic growth are going disproportionately to profits and to the people who accrue those profits, and that in turn increases the gap basically between the very rich and the rest. And the evidence for that, I think, is manifold. The wage share, for example, consistently falling over the last 20 years. This country fallen dramatically, actually worse than almost anywhere else in the Western world. So would you accept that that's a fact? And do you think there's anything you should be considering about that when you're making budgetary choices? Because it's never really discussed. And although interestingly, I know it's almost sort of a laughing, a subject to be laughed at here, wealth taxes, but actually in the United States, they're actually talking about wealth taxes now, about redistributive wealth taxes. So is that even a consideration for you, to look at that? And who is getting the benefit of economic growth?
Okay, Deputy Boyd Barrett, thank you. I'm going to just let the Minister back in, then we can have to come to a conclusion, unfortunately. Thank you.
The figures that you're referring to, we believe, are produced by the Central Statistics Office rather than ourselves. So we will have a look and see if we can identify what you're referring to and give you a more up-to-date version of it. But to the best of my knowledge, over the last 2 years, the Department of Finance have not published sectoral attributions of profit. I think it's more likely that's come from the CSO. In relation to the share that wages, income and profit have of national income, yes, it is a matter that is of concern to me. And you may have been present in the National Economic Dialogue where Michael Sullivan gave a presentation on this and talked about the effects of this in politics in other countries. And in terms of how we look to respond back to it, it's by having a progressive income tax system, and it's by playing our part in the work that is underway now in relation to international tax cooperation to ensure that global companies in particular are taxed fairly and effectively.
But would you not say, just one supplement, but having a progressive, and we can debate, and we have debated what's progressive, what isn't, right? But let's say I even accept that your budgets are progressive recently. I don't, by the way, but let's say I did. But let's say I did. They're not redistributive. And in order to close that gap, they have to be redistributive. If there is a growing concentration of wealth and income in the hands of a small minority, and the CSO stuff bears that out. If wage share is falling as a share of national income, can I just finish? Can I just finish this question, right? Which it is, and I don't think you dispute that. Do you not think, in order to close that gap, you need redistributive tax policy, not just progressive tax policy, redistributive tax policy?
Thank you, Minister.
So I think the most important graph in the intersection between politics and economics at the moment is the share that income has of national income. And I believe that what has happened in that over the last number of decades explains many of the challenges that we now have in politics. So I'm well aware of the analysis that you're referring to, and well aware of the work that has been done comparing the rate of return on capital to the rate of return on labour and the debate in relation to taxation on each. In relation to, do we need redistributive economic policies to deal with that? The answer to the question is that we do. And I look at how we can play our part in that as an open and small economy. And I go back to the answers that I gave to you earlier on. And for example, I would have thought that the fact that our corporation tax collection has increased is a sign of the fact that we are able to tax effectively rising profits within those share of global profits that are attributed to Ireland. And that's what we have done over the last number of years.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much, Deputy. And with that, I'm going to draw our meeting here today to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you, Minister, for your contribution with your officials today. I'd like to thank all the deputies for the interaction. It was, as always, an interesting, robust and informative interaction. There being no further business, we are concluded, and our meeting will now stand adjourned until Tuesday the 9th of July at 2 p.m. Thank you all very much.